Workbench moderation is fantastic for creating custom workflows that make sense within your organization. You can find the Workbench moderation module at drupal.org/project/workbench_moderation. Once the module is installed, we can come to the modules page under the Workbench tab, enable Workbench moderation. Now, before we configure the module, we'll need to enable moderation on a content type by visiting its configuration page. So we'll go to Structure, Content Types, Article, and under the publishing options, we need to first create new revisions, then we can enable moderation of revisions. We can also select the default state, draft, needs review, or published. These are automatically generated by the Workbench moderation module, and we'll see those in just a second. I'm going to leave it as draft and save the content type. One thing to note is that the Workbench moderation module does not require the Workbench module, or views for that matter, but it does provide two views, My Drafts and Needs Review, that will show up if you're using both the Workbench and Views module. If you're not using the Workbench module, you can clone these views and display them anywhere you'd like using the regular views methods. All right, let's configure Workbench moderation. We'll go to Configuration, Workbench, and Workbench moderation. The first tab is the States tab. Here you can see we have Draft, Needs Review, and Published. We just saw those when we edited our article content type, and this is where those options are created. We could add additional new states, for example, Legal Review, as the help text explains, but I'll just stick with the defaults for now. Let's move to the Transitions tab. Here we can select which states a piece of content can transition between. The default transitions allow content to move from draft to needs review, from needs review back to draft, and from needs review to published. We can add additional transitions here. You simply select the states from the select lists. I'm going to create one from draft directly to published. This isn't something that you'd want to allow most users to do, as it would defeat the purpose of using Workbench moderation in the first place. However, we'll pretend that some of our users are amazing writers and won't ever need to be moderated, just for the sake of the example. We will be able to select which roles can use which transitions when we talk about permissions. So just because a transition is listed here does not mean that every user will be able to use any transition. Before we take a look at permissions though, let's take a look at the last tab, Check Permissions. The Check Permissions tab presents a handy little tool that can be used to identify why a particular user cannot perform a given action. For example, if our authenticated users are unable to create an article, we can select the role Authenticated User, the moderation task Author Moderated Content, and the content type Article. Then click Check. When we do that, we will get a list of permissions that we may need to give to the authenticated user role in order for them to perform the given task. There's also a notice that says the authenticated user role may be a qualified author regardless of these notices, etc. This is because the module is checking the role against Workbench moderation specific permissions and is not checking permissions like administer content and bypass moderation restrictions. If you're curious which permissions are being checked, there's a fantastic list of recommended permissions for each type of content administrator, for example, author, editor, moderator, and publisher, in the online documentation at drupal.org/node/1175592. I'll actually walk you through each of these recommended permission sets in just a minute. So because the permissions can get pretty complicated, if you're having issues, the Check Permissions tab is a great place to see if it's simply an issue with permissions. Let's take a quick look at how this can work.